Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest bite-sized learning module from the UN Global Compact Network Australia. These are a series of conversations we're having with leading experts around the world, unpacking key human rights issues for Australian businesses. My name is Caskey, and I look after the human rights workstream at the UN Global Compact Network in Australia. And it's my privilege today to be here at One Year Indigenous Furniture in Sydney with some of their beautiful Indigenous furniture around us. It's also my privilege today to be joined by Bennett Freeman, one of the key actors in the business and human rights space. We're going to be discussing some of his latest research and publications on civic freedoms and human rights defenders. Now, Bennett's CV is too long to list, but just to note, Bennett is an Associate Fellow at the International Law Program at Chatham House. He previously also served as Senior Vice President at Calvert Investments from 2006 to 2015, and as US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. Bennett also has a close history of working with the UN Global Compact, even since its inception as part of its expert advisory group with our UN Global Compact Network office hosted in New York, and now working as part of the team on SDG 16 Transformational Governance Frameworks. Bennett, thank you so much for making the time and being here.
Chris, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. And you're right, I've had a long association with the Global Compact in New York and elsewhere around the world, but it's a pleasure to be with you here in Australia and talk with your members of the Australian network.
Fantastic. Now, today we're going to be talking about business engagement with this important issue of civic space. But I know that this will be a new term for many. So Bennett, to start us off, can you give us an overview of what is civic space and why is it so important?
So civic space, or to use a similar phrase, shared space, is the idea that there are certain elements that define civil society itself, but are also of fundamental, even existential importance to business. I'm talking about the rule of law, accountable governance, and civic freedoms. Those are the lifeblood elements that make civil society possible, but those are also the underpinnings of sustainable and profitable business and investment environments. So in my view and in my experience, there is and should be a convergence of interests and values between civil society and business. Of course, that's not always the case. It's often not the case. There's often divergence between civil society interests and business interests. We've had a tension between democracy and capitalism, for example, for decades, for couple centuries now. These elements are often in tension, but I see a real opportunity and a growing possibility to align business and civil society around civic space, what I call shared space, rule of law, accountable governance, and those basic civic freedoms.
And when we talk about, I suppose, civic freedoms in particular, there's references to all sorts of different international treaties. This is part of the International Human Rights Framework. Can you unpack a little bit more, when we talk about civic freedoms, which human rights are we talking about?
So, sure, these are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other covenants that have been the human rights instruments that have been emerged in the international community now for the last 3/4 of a century. But to really make it clear and simple, straightforward for all of us to understand, the civic freedoms that really bind and I hope should unite most tangibly civil society and business are really three. It's freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And these are all alluded to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the UN Global Compact, in the ILO core labor standards, of course, with freedom of association. And the three, expression, assembly, and association, are really intertwined. And think of it not as an a la carte menu, but as a prefixed. They all run together, and you can't really take one away and have the other two stand on their own. workers can't exercise freedom of association without freedom of expression or freedom of assembly. And I think that these civic freedoms should really be fully supported, encouraged, promoted, and when necessary, defended by business in their own interests.
And of course, hearing you talk through some of those international treaties, I'm drawn to, of course, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as being the authoritative standard for effectively integrating respect for human rights into your business. When it asks companies to look at which relevant human rights should be included in that process, it of course turns them to the Bill of Rights, which then in turn turns them to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they're definitely part of the discussion. It should be very much there as part of the UNGP framework. I want to just sort of, if I'm a business and I want to act in alignment with the UNGP or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights framework, what do I actually need to do to protect civic space?
So those are the right human rights instruments all pulled together for business in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, ratified by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011, that really provided the floor, not the ceiling, for business support for human rights, respect for human rights across the board. When it comes to civic space, shared space, there are really two ways of looking at business responsibility here. The first is to do no harm, is to not make statements or take actions that undermine rule of law, accountable governance, any of those civic freedoms, or those protected by or working to defend those civic freedoms for all of us. We call those people human rights defenders. It's a large category. It includes human rights lawyers and activists, indigenous community leaders, land and environmental defenders, and sometimes journalists who uncover abuses, anti-corruption investigators. And it's unfortunately there's been a well-documented record of business undermining and at times even attacking human rights defenders and the civic freedoms upon which human rights defenders depend. But there's a positive way of looking at this as well, provided that we bear in mind first and foremost, do no harm. And that's to understand that there is this shared space. There should be this convergence of values and interests among civil society writ large and human rights defenders in particular, and business. And I had the privilege of developing a report for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and International Service for Human Rights called Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. And in that report, we made the case for why and how business, especially large multinational corporations, should support civic freedoms and specifically support human rights defenders when under pressure or attack.
And I suppose if I'm, again, a business and I'm one of those multinational corporations and I want to meet the expectation to respect human rights in a way that actually sort of starts to speak to some of those support mechanisms, what sort of messaging should I have in the market, particularly for human rights defenders, so that they have comfort that that space is protected?
The messaging in the market is, we know who you are, we respect your work, we understand its vital importance to your communities, to our society, to the world, and indeed its importance to our business and how we go about our business. And we value that work. And the other message, I think, to deliver, besides the fundamental one of respect, is to convey the message that when you're under pressure, when you're under attack, we can be allies, not adversaries. And there's been a history, a legacy of distrust that has separated business from human rights defenders. We could try to draw lines under that and move forward with some shared values and interests. And I see more examples now in my work and travels around the world where business will support human rights defenders in certain circumstances, in particular countries, and will support this enabling environment of civic freedoms. And they do it both out of respect for the defenders and the rights holders and the societies, the economies where they operate, but also in their own interests.
I think that's such an interesting relationship that we're seeing play out. Of course, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights asks companies first and foremost to assess and address adverse human rights impacts. I think I'm curious to get your take as well. So, as part of more of sort of these, I suppose, social impact activities that we're seeing more in this space as well, how do you see the two sort of playing out as we go forward?
Nothing is more important than avoiding and, when necessary, diminishing and remedying the adverse impacts. Yeah. And there are ways to support the broader landscape or ecosystem, if you will, of human rights and civic space. And that can be done through it is being done through innumerable ways, all kinds of initiatives and partnerships, issue-specific, sector-specific, country-specific. But I'm seeing a trend that I'm working as hard as I can with many, many others around the world to encourage, which is to ask companies, individually, but groups of companies, when possible, to be affirmative advocates in the policy debate, in the public arena, and sometimes even explicitly in the political arena when it comes to defending civic freedoms and in democratic countries, democratic institutions, and elections. And I'll just name a few examples. One that played a very, very small part in instigating, or at least encouraging, was the intervention, which is a strong word, but I think a correct one, of corporate America and Wall Street, but just before and after the 2020 presidential election, to make very clear statements supporting the peaceful transfer of power. And those statements were made 2 months, 10 weeks before the fateful January 6, 2021, and at least corporate America and Wall Street were on record supporting the peaceful transfer of power and the responsible transition, which we almost didn't have. So that's one example. The second example of the efforts of global apparel brands to support the end of forced labor in Uzbekistan. I was deeply involved in the cotton campaign that mobilized a multi-stakeholder coalition to support the end of forced labor, frankly, through a combination of a boycott, economic pressure, and diplomatic engagement. Another example are the continuing efforts beginning in the mid-late 2010s by apparel brands in Cambodia to support freedom of association when under attack in that country. And another example that we still read about every week or two now in mid-2023 is the extraordinary mobilization of the technology community and investment community in Israel to support rule of law and the independence of the judiciary in the face of quite radical reforms. And finally, I can't resist observing, being in Australia, but as a non-Australian, one who cares deeply about these issues globally, to note with great interest the support that has been made clear in recent weeks, at least in the Australian winter, the Northern Hemisphere summer, of support for the Voice to Parliament referendum that will be voted on later this year. It's been encouraging from a global perspective to see and hear major voices from corporate Australia, if that's a term of art, just as corporate America is, supporting this referendum in the interests of a even more inclusive democracy that takes into account not just past injustices, but a more just, equitable future for all Australians, which is something that as a non-Australian, but as somebody who cares about democracy and human rights worldwide, I really applaud, and I'm hopeful that the Australian business community will further amplify its voice in the coming weeks before this historic vote.
Mhm. And the UN Global Compact Network in Australia, of course, we issued our statement on this a couple of months ago, and it was really a challenge to our participants, in particular around 10 principle number 1, which asks businesses to support and respect the promotion of internationally recognized human rights. We see this as a clear pathway for businesses to be supporting the right to self-determination, the right to be consulted on measures to eliminate racial discrimination. So hopefully we can see more businesses starting to support this.
Let's hope. And the Global Compact was created to support these rights, to support these, encourage these responsibilities on the part of business. Australian business now has this great opportunity that is already is demonstrating. So looking forward to the outcome here, but I know it's a hard debate here in Australia, but I'm heartened by what the Global Compact is saying and doing.
Fantastic. Bennett, I have one more final question for you. We recently saw the launch of the Lawyers Association on Business and Human Rights, and if I recall correctly, you may have keynoted the launch in New York. I'm curious what your hopes are for this initiative, and in particular how some of these professional services firms, such as lawyers and others, can better meet that responsibility to respect human rights.
So I'm very hopeful about this initiative. There was a launch in Australia. We've had a couple in the U.S., in New York and Washington and London and Geneva. And lawyers, of course, played a critical role, will definitely play a critically important role in the business and human rights and broader responsible business arenas. But the key here, I think, in the challenge that, for what it's worth, I put to the lawyers in New York City at the end of March 2023 is great. Be a learning platform for human rights due diligence, for compliance, for regulatory and policy developments. That's fine and well. It's important. But there's an even more important challenge and opportunity, which is to think through some of the professional responsibility issues that are unique to the legal community, but also in some ways are common across the professional service world with the public affairs, public relations companies, with the former Big Four accounting firms turned mega consultancies, the McKinseys of the world, to think about responsibilities towards clients, but to society, to the world. Think about how to define the client's interests. Think about the convergence of clients' interests with respecting human rights. Think about the due diligence that companies of law firms in particular may want to undertake in selecting clients and how they advise those clients. These professional service firms, including law firms, are trying to be profitable businesses. I understand and respect that, of course. But I think that due diligence on their part towards clients is important. If they apply due diligence in ways that are so rigorous that they turn down 7 out of 10 clients, they'll be out of business. That's not very helpful to anybody. But if they apply it in ways that might turn down a smaller number, but still based on principles, that could be a benefit. And if they tell a client in a particular instance that we're going to have to resign the account if you don't take our advice, that can be useful. These are not easy issues. There's tough dilemmas that companies face, but I think that professional service firms, not least law firms, need to really think hard themselves about the dilemmas that they face around how they advise their clients when it comes to human rights, and very specifically these so-called SLAP suits, strategic litigation suits, which have the intent, certainly the appearance, but usually the intent of silencing or shutting down critics of companies. I happen to think that practice is insidious, and I think that there needs to be a real reckoning within the global legal community about not just the legal, but the ethical, political, and reputational dimensions of these SLAP suits for clients and for the companies who are the clients of using them, but for the law firms that are doing the work facilitating them. There should be a shared responsibility here to think through not just narrow self-interest, but what a broader shared responsibility looks like.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Bennett. That's been extremely insightful, and I think helping us sort of tease through some of these issues that are really starting to come to the fore for businesses. And it's been absolutely wonderful to have you down here in Australia, and thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you all for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the UN Global Compact, you can visit us at unglobalcompact.org.au, and I'll be sure to link some of the resources from our discussion below, including Bennett's report on shared space under pressure in the link below. Thank you again, Bennett. We'll
Thank you.
see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you.